Before we talk about the important issues out there and the subject for today, I'd like to add to what you heard about myself and tell you a bit more about my background and what I do and who I am, so that you will understand later the things I'm saying and why I'm saying them. As you heard, the name is Khaled Abu Toameh, and I'm an Arab Muslim living in Jerusalem. I also happen to be an Israeli citizen, and the reason is because my father belongs to the Israeli Arab community inside Israel. On the other hand, I'm also a Palestinian because my mother is a Palestinian from the West Bank. So if you're confused, like I am, you can call me an Israeli Arab Muslim Palestinian. And I've been working as a journalist for nearly 27 or 28 years now, covering all what happens in the West Bank and Gaza. We call it over there Palestinian affairs. And my career as a journalist started by working for the PLO many years ago. Actually, it started immediately after I finished high school. Now, I always wanted to be a journalist, and after high school, I walked into a PLO newspaper office in Jerusalem, and they hired me first as a translator, then as a correspondent, and finally as an editor. And now, if you're wondering what's the connection between the PLO and journalism, there were days when Israel allowed the PLO to have newspapers in Jerusalem, in Israel, licensed by Israel, funded by the PLO, although the two parties back then in the 70s and in the 80s did not recognize each other, but Israel turned a blind eye. So I wanted to be a journalist, and I walked into one of these newspapers, as I said, thinking it was really about journalism, only to find myself, doing different things. But fortunately for me, during the time that I was working for this PLO newspaper, I also went to Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And when I finished university, I had to make a decision. Do I go back and work in the PLO and do the same stuff that we were doing? Or do I go out to become what I call a real journalist? And it took me perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision. And I went out to work with the international media and later also with the Israeli media. Now, when I say work with the international media, what does that mean? We have hundreds of foreign journalists who come to that part of the world every year, every month, every week, and sometimes even every day to cover that conflict. And most of these journalists, besides going to Israel, they also go to the West Bank and Gaza. Now, when it comes to working inside Israel, fortunately for us, the media people, Israel is a free and open country, a country that respects the freedom of the media, a country where a foreign journalist can basically write anything he or she wants against Israel and can still walk in downtown Jerusalem without having to worry about his or her safety. But when it comes to working in the Palestinian areas, it's a totally different story. You cannot wake up in the morning as a foreign journalist and drive into a Palestinian village or refugee camp on your own and say, good morning, I'm Eitan from the New York Times, I want to speak to Hamas, please. It doesn't work like that for a number of reasons. One is you don't know the language, you need a translator with you. Number two, you don't know your way around, you need a guide. And most importantly, it's not safe. So the foreign media, when it comes to covering what happens in the West Bank and Gaza, is totally dependent on local people who help them. And that's basically what I've been doing for the past 22 or 23 years with the international media, taking them to the West Bank and Gaza and making sure they return home safely. In the course of this work with the international media, I became myself a writer on the Palestinian issue, writing in numerous newspapers around the world, from the Wall Street Journal to US News and World Report, Washington Post, most of the British tabloids and other newspapers in Europe. I also became a filmmaker doing documentaries for BBC and several American and European networks. And for the past 22 years, I'm also the Palestinian affairs producer for NBC News over there. Now, about 9 years ago, I was approached by the Jerusalem Post, actually through Caroline, and they asked me if I could also join them and write for them on Palestinian affairs. Why? Because when the second Intifada started in September 2000, Israeli journalists stopped traveling to the West Bank and Gaza, and there was a need for people to cover what's been happening, what's going on over there. So they asked me if I could write for them on the Palestinian issue, and I did not hesitate, and I went to write for the Jerusalem Post, in addition to the work that I occasionally do with the international media out there. So that's my story, and that's my background, that's what I do. Now, one of the first questions that people keep asking me And I do go to many dangerous places, like University of Irvine and other places, DePaul and all these things, not Gaza, not the West Bank, but one of the first questions that I've been asked on these at these dangerous places is, what kind of a story is this? Does it make sense? When did you become pro-Israel? Someone asked me the other day. And I'm like, what are you guys talking about? He said, well, I don't understand. I mean, you started your career as a journalist working for a PLO newspaper, and you end up writing in a Jewish newspaper? What happened to you? And I told him, listen, folks, nothing happened to me, but as a journalist, I have absolutely no problem working for any news organization that is willing to provide me with a free platform. And I don't care if my editors are Jews, Christians, Muslims, or even from the Hare Krishna movement. As long as I'm free to write whatever I want, I have absolutely no problem. And to be honest with you, I even find it sad and ironic that as an Arab Muslim living in that part of the world, the only place that I can express myself freely in is in a Jewish paper. Now, I'm not saying this because the Jerusalem Post pays me a salary. It's a lousy salary, you don't want to hear about it. I'm saying this because every Palestinian child knows that we don't have a free media in the West Bank and Gaza, not to mention the rest of the Arab world, of course. Now, someone else asked me, he said, okay, now aren't you seen as a traitor because you work for a Jewish paper? And I thought, absolutely not. He said, why? I said, because we, the Arabs over there, have never ever decided to boycott the Israeli media. The first time I personally heard about all this talk about boycotting Israel was when I visited the university campus in Canada a few years ago. But over there, we as Arabs have never ever boycotted the Israeli media. I forgot to mention, but for a period of 14 years, I was also writing in Hebrew for a Hebrew paper on the Palestinians, and among the people I interviewed were Yasser Arafat, the founder of Hamas, all the leaders of Hamas, even the most wanted terrorists in the West Bank and Gaza, talked to the Israeli media. Just 2 weeks ago, the Palestinian president talked to the Israeli media. In that sense, by the way, the Palestinians are clever. Why? Because they know that in Israel there is a free and open media, and that if you want to relay a message to the Israeli public, the best way to do it is through the Israeli media. So I have absolutely no problem, as I said, working for an Israeli paper. Now, sometimes I say that, I wish the problem of the media was the only problem that we have in the West Bank and Gaza. But as you all know by now, and as Caroline also referred to, it's a total mess out there. I'm one of those who have been arguing for many years that things have been going in the wrong direction in that part of the world ever since the peace process started. Or, if you want, ever since the signing of the Oslo Accords. Now, I'm one of those who back then thought that the idea of Oslo was good. Separation between Jews and Palestinians who don't want to live together is nice. And disengagement, and you know what, even the two-state solution is a nice solution, although I personally think it's not practical and it's not going to work. But in theory, it sounds nice, and today we all have to say that we like the two-state solution, at least because President Obama wants us to say so, we say so. So back then, I thought that the concept of Oslo was good. My problem is not with all these wonderful ideas that Oslo came with. My problem is with the way Oslo was implemented, because Oslo was based on the assumption in Israel, in the West, that if you dump Yasser Arafat and company in the West Bank and Gaza, and you give them billions of dollars in guns, you will get peace. And so what if Arafat establishes a corrupt dictatorship? And so what if he deprives his people of the money? And so what if he establishes 15 or 16 different security forces that are actually militias and gangs and mafias roaming the Palestinian street? As long as Arafat is on our payroll, our meaning the US, Israel, and the West, he will do anything we want. So they brought Yasser Arafat over there, and the show began in 1994. It was actually a one-man show called Yasser Arafat. He established this thing called the Palestinian National Authority, and the show began. By the way, one of the first things that Arafat did when he entered the West Bank in Gaza was not to use the guns that the Israelis and the Americans gave him to fight Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Arafat's first action was to order a massive crackdown on the Palestinian media to make sure that all those working in the Palestinian media were 100% loyal to Yasser Arafat. And the result of this campaign was that more than 30 Palestinian journalists were either killed or kicked out of the of the profession, or harassed or imprisoned, or had even to run away from the country. But as Caroline also said, this is a story that you will not find in the mainstream media, like many other stories. When I personally tried to alert many of my foreign colleagues back then, as someone who works with the international media, to the fact that there is financial corruption and abuse of human rights under Yasser Arafat, and that Arafat is not doing the right things, many of the foreign journalists, including American, Canadian, British journalists, widely respected journalists, when I told them that there is financial corruption in the Palestinian Authority, they asked me, "Are you on the payroll of the Zionist lobby? Did Jews pay you money to say these things against Mr. Yasser Arafat?" And I was like, what? Where is this Jewish lobby and how much do they pay? I'll just quit journalism and go and work for them. The foreign media refused to believe what Palestinians were saying. They even refused to believe what the PLO was saying, that the PLO is corrupt back then. Many of these foreign journalists back then told me, listen, maybe these stories about financial corruption are true. But we told our editors back home, and they're not really interested in the story. Our editors said, just give us an anti-Israel story, give us an anti-occupation story. It will make our lives much easier, and we might even receive an award from the United Nations. Other journalists told me, well, maybe these stories you're telling us are true, but it's too dangerous for us to report about them because we need to go back to Ramallah and Gaza. Arafat might kill us. How are we going to work in this part of the world if we write things that reflect negatively on the PLO? And I was telling them back then, excuse me folks, what are you guys talking about? If anyone has good reason to be afraid, it's me, the local Arab Muslim journalist who lives over here and wakes up in the morning and goes to Ramallah and Gaza and says these things openly. And besides, you guys have American, European passports that will protect you, that gives you some kind of immunity. And if you are really scared, as you say you are, I was telling them, what are you doing in the Middle East covering a conflict? Go back to your newspaper and write about the sports or the weather. You should not come to cover a conflict if you're going to allow yourself to be intimidated by any party. But as I said back then, the name of the game was, just give us an anti-Israel story. It will make our lives much easier. We don't want to report about these things. This is the hiding of the information that Caroline was talking about. And by the way, I'm also disappointed with the Israeli media, because when I tried back then to get stories like this into the Israeli media, my editors did not want to listen. They said, this must be propaganda, this is, it must be exaggerated and all these things. Now, by turning a blind eye to what Yasser Arafat was doing, and to the fact that he was depriving his people of the money, what did we do? We allowed Yasser Arafat to radicalize Palestinian society, because many Palestinians woke up one morning and said, to hell with this peace process, to hell with Yasser Arafat. We don't see the fruits of peace. Where's all the money going? How come instead of a hospital and a school and a university, we got a casino? And how come instead of building housing projects for the poor people, Arafat is building big villas for his aides? And how come instead of giving the poor people money, he's giving his wife $100,000 a month to do so that she could do her shopping in Paris? And how come? Arafat's financial corruption radicalized Palestinians and drove them into the open arms of Hamas. There's another reason why Palestinians, after the peace process, went to Hamas, and that's Arafat's incitement and indoctrination. After the peace process began, the international community gave Yasser Arafat money to open a TV and radio station. And I can tell you, as an Arab viewer and someone who watched what Arafat was broadcasting in this media, his message was jihad, jihad, jihad. Let's kill my Jewish peace partners. Let's even kill the Americans and the infidels and the crusaders and the imperialists and all these people who are giving me money. Now you would ask yourselves, but was Arafat really so dumb? Why would he incite against his Jewish peace partners and against those who were giving him money? Does it make sense? No, it does make sense in the Arab world, because this is exactly how the dictators in the Arab world survive. By constantly blaming the miseries of your people on Jews, you never accept responsibility for anything. And as an Arab dictator, you always need to make sure that your people are busy hating someone else, preferably the Jews. Because if they're not, these people might wake up in the morning, come and knock on your door, and may God forbid they might demand reform and democracy. So Arafat unleashed this wave of incitement, of course in Arabic, not in English, in the mosques, in the media, and in the rhetoric. Now, if you are telling your people day and night that the Jews are sons of monkeys and pigs, and they're evil, and they killed JFK, and they're behind the earthquakes and the tsunamis, and they're behind all the bad things, and they're spreading AIDS in the Arab world, and I don't know what, your people will wake up in the morning and say, well, why aren't we killing the Jews like Hamas is saying? So Arafat's incitement also drove Palestinians into the open arms of Hamas. Hamas became so strong that when they woke up one morning and challenged Arafat's people in a free and democratic election, they won. They won because they were clever. They ran under the banner of change and reform. Now we have to bear in mind, I met President Obama before he was elected. And he didn't even know that Hamas had run under the banner, of the same banner. But anyway, we have to bear in mind that the US, back then, the US administration ignored warnings from Israel and the PLO that Hamas was going to win the election. The US administration did not know what every Palestinian child on the street knew, that if you hold a free and democratic election in the Palestinian areas, Hamas would win. Believe me, even if Ariel Sharon had run in the Palestinian election under the same banner, he would have also won. The US administration allowed Hamas to run in the election unconditionally, ignoring the US administration even put pressure on Israel to open the post offices in Jerusalem so that Arabs in Jerusalem could vote in that election. And 7 Hamas candidates ran under Israel in Jerusalem in that election, and the result was that a majority of Arabs in Jerusalem voted for Hamas because of the failure to understand. One day before that election, in January 2006, I was asked by a small newspaper in New York called the Wall Street Journal to write an op-ed about what's going to happen tomorrow in the Palestinian elections. And I wrote there an article saying Hamas is going to win the elections if it's a free and democratic election. Before publishing that story, the editors phoned me and said, where did you get this big scoop from? And I was like, what? This is not a big scoop. I'm just a little Arab reporter in the field. I happen to read the writing on the wall. First of all, it's in Arabic. You guys don't want to read it. And second, you don't even want to see the wall, and there's no shortage of walls over here. They told me back then before they published it, listen, this is very surprising because we just talked to the office of Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney, I don't know, and all the think tank groups and everyone is surprised to hear that Hamas is going to win the election. I told them, listen, if you publish the article tomorrow and I turn out to be mistaken, I'm ready tomorrow morning to go to a lawyer and give up my profession as a journalist and sign a document saying that I will go and open a small grocery in a refugee camp. They did eventually publish it. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, how come Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney and the State Department and the CIA and the FBI and NASA did not know what every Palestinian child on the street knew? This raises very serious questions about what's going on over there, and I don't even see that the US administration, or let's say the Americans, have even learned from their mistakes. The same mistakes that were committed in the past are being committed today. The same money is being poured on the same guys who stole the money the first time. After Hamas came to power, if I were the US, I would have gone to the guys who lost the election, the Fatah people, and said, folks, come here. Hamas is in power largely because of your corruption. Why don't you guys go reform yourselves, get rid of all these corrupt people, and challenge Hamas in another free and democratic election. But the mistake that the Americans made was that they went to Fatah and said, Fatah, here are guns, here's money, go bring down this Hamas government. Now these attempts backfired and made Hamas even more popular on the Palestinian street, until Hamas managed in exactly 3 years ago to kick all of Arafat's people out of Gaza. And I was down there in Gaza when that happened. And what I'm telling you is, again, not Jewish propaganda, because I saw it with my own eyes. As soon as Hamas started shooting, thousands of Palestinians rushed towards the border with Egypt. Because for those who don't know, and I've discovered that many people in North America don't know, Gaza also has a joint border with Egypt. And what did the dictator in Cairo do? He sealed the border, sending thousands of Palestinians to knock on Israel's door for help. And again, from what I saw, Israel was the only country in the world that sent helicopters and ships and tanks and ambulances and even taxis to save Muslims from being slaughtered by Muslims. And Israel took them and dumped them in the West Bank, and that was the end of the game. And I said before, where do we stand today? I said, I think the two-state solution is a good solution in theory. In the end, we did get a two-state solution over there. The Palestinians got 2 states. One in Gaza and one in the West Bank. Now the one in Gaza is this radical Islamic state run by Hamas and funded by our friend Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and backed by Syria, Sudan, Hezbollah, Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Jihad, and some people even say Al-Qaeda. I don't rule it out. But I can tell you as a Muslim, that's the last place I would ever want to live under. So that's what we have down there in Gaza. In the middle we have Israel. And in the West Bank we also have Israel. But we have this powerless, corrupt, secular regime of all these former Yasser Arafat cronies, Abu Mazen, Abu Shmazen, Abu Ala, all these Abus, sitting in Ramallah pretending to be a president and a prime minister and a government and I don't know what. We have to be very careful. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is in power in the West Bank, largely, if not solely, thanks to the presence of the Israel Defense Forces in the West Bank. If Israel redeploys or withdraws under the current circumstances, Hamas will take over the West Bank and the PLO will collapse. It is Israel's presence in the West Bank that is keeping Mahmoud Abbas and company in power. Or think of it like this. If Israel carries out what the PLO is demanding in public, which is a withdrawal to the 1967 borders, 10 minutes later, Mahmoud Abbas and company will be dragged to downtown Ramallah and hanged in a public square. If I were Israel under the current circumstances, I would not repeat the mistake I made in 2005. The last time we gave Mahmoud Abbas land was in 2005, and he ran away handing it over to Hamas, and I'm talking about Gaza. If that mistake is repeated in the West Bank, on your next visit to Israel, you will have to take a flight to Cairo airport or to Amman airport, and from there take a bus or a taxi to Israel, because Hamas and Ahmadinejad will be sitting on the hilltops overlooking Ben Gurion airport. I'm not saying this to exaggerate, but believe me, this is what every Palestinian will tell you over there. Even if we hold a free and democratic election, tomorrow morning in the West Bank, Hamas will take over. So if I were Israel, I'd watch my steps very carefully. Now, we also have to bear in mind that the 2 Palestinian states are at war with each other. And it is Israel's physical presence between the West Bank and Gaza that is preventing Hamas and Fatah from dispatching suicide bombers and rockets at each other. They hate each other more than they hate Israel, by the way. And if you follow the literature and the media propaganda that they're waging against each other, you will see that suddenly it's the Fatah people who are the sons of the monkeys and pigs. And suddenly it's the Hamas people who spread AIDS in the Arab world. And that's why I've been saying for a long time that incitement and indoctrination can backfire and is also self-destructive. Now, I said Israel's physical presence is keeping Muslims from killing Muslims once again. Now, the question we should ask ourselves in light of all these divisions and all this mess that is going on in the Palestinian areas, how do we move forward with the thing called the peace process? And I can tell you, first of all, each time I hear this term, peace process, my heart falls, because I say, One more peace process like this and we'll all finish Jews and Arabs over there. The only way to move forward with the peace process is by going first to the Palestinians and insisting that they get their act together. If our President Obama, instead of chasing Bibi Netanyahu and begging him to accept the two-state solution and I don't know what, I would first go to the Palestinians and say, listen folks, why don't you guys stop killing each other? Stop throwing each other from the 15th and 18th floor. Stop committing atrocities against each other. Why don't you dismantle all these mafias and militias and gangs that are roaming the Palestinian street? Why don't you form some kind of institutions, some form of government? And why don't you at least speak in one voice? Because we don't know who we're talking to on the Palestinian side. And then let's go and sit with Israel and see what Israel has to offer you. This is the only way to move forward. But in the meantime, we're just wasting our time by talking to a partner that we know, and if we don't know, that's even worse, cannot deliver. Let's assume that tomorrow morning, Bibi Netanyahu and the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, whose term in office, by the way, expired in January 2009, but he stayed because Condoleezza Rice told him to stay in power. Let's assume that these two gentlemen, they meet in Jerusalem and they sign a peace agreement between Israel and Palestine. That's very nice. And I will even stand outside and demonstrate in favor of it. But excuse me, where is the Palestinian president going to implement the peace agreement? The Palestinian president cannot go to Gaza. His private house in Gaza has been turned into a Hamas interrogation center. If he tries to go to Gaza, he will be hanged not inside Gaza, but at the entrance to Gaza by Hamas. So he can't go to Gaza. In the West Bank, he has limited power and limited credibility among his own people. So where's this Palestinian president going to implement a peace agreement? He was elected in January 2005 to succeed Yasser Arafat. And since then, I have not seen him in one village or refugee camp in the West Bank, which he supposedly controls. And that's not because an Israeli soldier banned him from entering these areas or because of the wall or the fence or the checkpoints or I don't know what, because he knows he has no credibility among his own people. So, excuse me, where is the Palestinian president going to implement any peace agreement? In Tel Aviv? It doesn't make any sense. In the meantime, another mistake that the Obama administration is making is dragging Palestinians against their will to the negotiating table when you know that they have nothing to offer and they're not ready for compromise. Obama is making the same mistake that President Clinton made at Camp David by dragging a Palestinian to the negotiating table, and at this negotiating table putting very explosive issues like Jerusalem, borders, refugees and settlements on the table and forcing him to talk about it. Now Mahmoud Abbas is not stupid. He knows that he cannot make any compromise on these issues. But Obama wants him to do something. So he's being dragged against his will. Now what's going to happen in a month or two? Mahmoud Abbas is not going to get 100% because Israel is not going to give him 100%, and he will declare the failure of the peace process. And who's going to be blamed? Israel. And where is that going to lead? Let's go back to the year 2000. Arafat was also not stupid. When Arafat was faced with all these explosive issues, Jerusalem, Temple Mount, refugees, settlements, he ran away at Camp David. Why? Because he knew that he could not make even a 1% concession on these issues. And a few weeks later, we got the second intifada. President Obama is playing with fire once again. Now, if I were President Obama, what would I do? I would try to maintain the status quo, which is not bad, by the way. Maintain the status quo, which means with Gaza we have a ceasefire. It's an unofficial ceasefire because Hamas got the message. Israel went in there about a year and a half ago, beat the hell out of them, and they got the message. So they're behaving themselves. On that front, we have a ceasefire. In the West Bank, we have some good things happening with these Abus, Abu Mazen and Abu, I don't know what, economic prosperity, some kind of economic development. On Sunday, they're opening a cinema in Jenin, and so we have a Turkish bath in Nablus, so that's nice. So we have nice things happening in the West Bank. in the midst of all these nice things that we have, stability with Gaza and economic development in the West Bank, suddenly President Obama comes and says, folks, peace process. And when people over there, as I said, hear the word peace process, it's like, oh my God, that means another cycle of violence is coming. It would have been better had we tried to consolidate the ceasefire with Hamas and at the same time continue with the economic development in the West Bank and wait until people are prepared for peace. I'm sorry to tell you that on the Palestinian side, there is really no partner today for any agreement. Hamas is not a partner to any agreement, because if anyone thinks that Hamas is going to wake up in the morning and sing Hatikva, that's not going to happen. And I personally give Hamas credit as someone who has been following Hamas from day one. I was actually at the press conference when they were established in 1989, and I can tell you since then they have not changed a word of their message or their charter. And I personally, as someone who has been following Hamas from day one, I never knew that Hamas was on its way to pragmatism and moderation and realism and recognizing Israel's right to exist until I visited Toronto 18 months ago. And I woke up in the morning and I went to have breakfast in my hotel, and I picked up a newspaper only to read a big article saying Hamas is on its way to moderation and recognizing Israel's right to exist and pragmatism, all these nice words. So I thought maybe because I had been away from the Middle East for 48 hours, I had missed a story, and you never know. In the Middle East, things happen. So I put the newspaper in my bag, and I took it back with me. And a few days later, I went to Ramallah with the newspaper. It's called the Globe and Mail, by the way. And I went to see some Hamas leaders. And I took out the newspaper and said, what's going on over here? I'm away for a few days, and you guys are already, marching towards pragmatism and realism. And said, what is this? Where'd you find this newspaper? I said, in Toronto. They said, well, we didn't even know that we had changed. So this brings me to the whole issue about disinformation and hiding information and all that. There's no need to interpret what Hamas says. There's no need to read between the lines. We have to be very careful what we read in the media and all these conceptions. As someone who has worked with thousands of foreign journalists over the past 22 years, I can tell you that I have become so cynical that when I read an article, I always tell myself, I'm sure the exact opposite is the truth, especially when it comes to what's happening inside Israel. Now, I'm not here to exonerate Israel and tell you, folks, Israel has done wonderful things and all that, but no. Israel has made 1,000 mistakes. But when we on the Arab side make 10,000 mistakes, the international media does not want to see them. And that's what worries me, because if I were to sum up my experience with the international media, I would say that these journalists who come over there, they come with this perception that there's a conflict over here, and in this conflict there are good guys and bad guys, and please don't confuse us with the facts, Khaled. It's too much for us. We cannot break the narrative that our readers are used to, so let's just stick to this narrative. Don't give us anything else. Now, another issue about the foreign coverage. Just a few days ago, I was with the New York Times bureau chief over there. We were on a panel, and he said something very important when he was asked about why Israel looks bad in the media. And he said, listen, Israel is a paradise for the foreign media. And I can tell you that he's right. Israel is the only place where many foreign journalists who come to the Middle East can attack Israel and still remain safe. 99% of the Middle East bureau chiefs that I have worked with over the past 22 or 23 years, they prefer to have their homes and offices in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, not only because of the nice bars and restaurants and beaches and beautiful women we have over there, but because they feel much safer living in Israel, and from Israel traveling for a few hours to Cairo, Amman, Gaza, and then coming back very quickly. So Israel also pays a very heavy price for being a democracy and for being very open to the international media. So on this happy or unhappy note, I'll leave it. Thank you.